I want also to thank Dean Catherine Ingracia for being here with us, and also Chris Shin, the director of the Humanities Research Center, as well as the members of the Migration Studies Lab, and of course, Dr. Bickham Mendez, who will be talking to us in a moment. Today's lecture is part of the speaker series organized by the Migration Studies Lab at VCU's Humanities Research Center. Our lab provides a forum and research home for VCU faculty and students interested in migration from any disciplinary or regional angle. The lab seeks to enhance collaboration between VCU and migrant communities. La presentación de hoy es parte de la serie de charlas organizadas por el Laboratorio de Estudios sobre la Migración del Centro de Investigaciones en Humanidades de VCU. Nuestro laboratorio representa un espacio de discusión y de investigación para los profesores y estudiantes de nuestra universidad, interesados en la migración desde cualquier perspectiva profesional o regional. El laboratorio busca fortalecer la colaboración entre VCU y las comunidades de migrantes. It is a great pleasure to have Dr. Jennifer Bickham Mendez with us today. Dr. Bickham Mendez is professor and chair of the Sociology Department at the College of William and Mary. She's the author of a book titled From the Revolution to the Maquiladoras, Gender, Labor, and Globalization in Nicaragua, published by Duke University Press in 2005. She is also the co-editor of two books, one titled Latinx Belonging, Community Building and Resilience in the United States, published by the University of Arizona Press in 2022, and the other one titled Border Politics, Social Movements, Collective Identity, and Globalization, published by New York University Press in 2015. In addition, Dr. Bickham Mendez has published several scholarly articles and book chapters related to her fields of research. Before we listen to Dr. Bickham Mendez, I want to mention that we will continue our speaker series on Monday, April 29 at noon. Doctors Saltanat Liebert and Grant Riesler from VCU Wilder School of Government and Public Affairs will be presenting on barriers to integration of immigrants in Virginia. The information on this talk will be coming through the Humanities Research Center. And also, on April 18th at 4, the Humanities Research Center is having another talk about public humanities here and now, titled Animal Plays by Pamela Taylor Turner on the study of animation. We'll have now with us Dr. Bickham Mendez. Thanks so much.
That kind introduction. It's on, right? Yeah. It's a real honor and a pleasure to be with you all here today. Thank you so much for inviting me and for having me and for coming out in this busy time of year. I so enjoyed the conversation that the students and the research assistants and I had earlier today. And I want to thank Abby, Antonio, Daniel, Ronnie, for making all the arrangements and making me feel so welcome and at home. It's kind of a theme of today's talk actually is how do we make those kinds of attachments and social connections? I am going to share with you, it's a little bit awkward because I have my notes here, but I'll try to make it work. I'm going to share with you, this isn't going to be a super academic talk. I'm going to share with you I've been researching Latin American immigration from Latin American contexts to the Williamsburg area where I've taught and worked for 25 years, for over 20 years. So I thought I would give kind of a overview of that, highlighting a couple of different projects. And then at the end, I think there's some community partners on Zoom or maybe in the audience. Along the way, I've worked with a lot of diverse community partners, and I have a few sort of recommendations or kind of ideas of things that I feel that I've learned from working with diverse groups. So I'll just get started. This is going to be... So it's 2003 and my office phone rings, interrupting my grading a seamlessly endless pile of student papers. And on the line was the director from the new Office of Service Learning, that's what we used to call it, at William and Mary, where I worked at that time as an assistant professor. She was looking for faculty who would be interested in attending a community forum about Hispanics in the Williamsburg area. And I thought to myself, there are Hispanics here, having only moved there about 4 years ago. Intrigued, I agreed to make my way to the public library. I don't like hiding behind the podium, but make my way to the public library. And what greeted me there that afternoon when I arrived on the scene would get any ethnographer's blood pumping. The auditorium was packed with representatives from over a dozen county agencies. From social services to, I might have to just do this, from social services to Head Start, to at that time, the only hospital, to the adult literacy program and the umbrella early childhood service agency. And the room was noisy and charged with energy. And it was clear that the people in the room had something they eagerly wanted to talk about, a common frustrating problem. And that problem was the arrival of a new group among their patients and clientele, a group that was unfamiliar and different to them, and with whom they could not even communicate directly. Transfixed, I watched as these participants wrestled with understanding who these people were, why they were here, and what they needed. And notably, there was no members of this group present, right, in this auditorium full of people. Our staff is spread so thin and doesn't have time to deal with this. They are neglecting their other clients. They need to learn English. They are afraid and they just want to keep a low profile. These people are being exploited and businesses are making a lot of money. The men are very machista and the women are used to being submissive. The women are not used to giving birth in the hospitals. As I left that meeting after hearing this conversation, my head was abuzz with questions that motivated the next 20 years of my research trajectory, really. Who were these newcomers? How did they end up here of all places? How would this community so attached to a particular history of identity and place respond to this new group of arrivals? Sorry, let me just, I'm realizing that I have to, forgive me. I want to make sure I don't go over, which I have a habit of doing. So these burning questions set me on a research path investigating the social dynamics involved as people from Latin American contexts have sought to build lives in the Williamsburg area, which is what I study. And in this talk, I'll tell you a little bit about research on mothers' access to social services and healthcare, gendered policing that occurs of immigrants in public space, and finally, my current and recent projects on public schools. Over this research trajectory, I've worked with numerous partnerships, and I hopefully will have some insights about that as well. So Greater Williamsburg, who here has been there? I know at least one person. Okay, many people have been there in part of school trips. Greater Williamsburg, there's where it's located. It's east of here on 64, and it brands itself as the birthplace of a nation. It occupies a significant place in nationalist settler narratives about this country's foundation. The area is the site of the first English settlement in the US at Jamestown and the capital of colonial Williamsburg. In Jamestown in 1607, white settlers of the original inhabitants of the Tidewater region of Virginia, among them the Powhatan, Pamunkey, and Kissiak, first came into contact. And 12 years later, and some 30 miles away at Point Comfort, in Hampton, the first enslaved Africans landed in English Virginia. And I think the processes of immigration and settlement that I'm going to talk about today must be contextualized within this history. Now, today, Williamsburg is a popular historical tourist and retirement destination. expanding residential and commercial development, and double-digit growth over the last 30 years have transformed it from a small town to a low-density suburb without a city. So if you went, you probably went as tourists to Williamsburg, or maybe you've just gone to visit people. It has grown exponentially, even since I moved there 25 years ago. And this pattern of growth and development is very relevant for the experiences of Latino immigrants to the area, and who are drawn to jobs that were created by this pattern of development and growth. Okay, so the two go hand in hand. Latin American immigrants in Williamsburg began to gain unprecedented public visibility in the early 2000s. And their numbers have grown over the last 20 years. Today, the population is between 7 and 8% Hispanic. That's kind of the only way to measure how many folks are there, is by looking at census data of Hispanic, which is, you know, problematic, not perfect. So that equates to around 8,000 people. There are about 111,000 people in the Greater Williamsburg area. And that's less than the state percentage of 10%. And it's, I guess it's right around on par with Richmond from what we were talking about earlier, Gabby. Since the 2000s and 10s, the public schools, which serve around 11,000 people, who serve 11,000 students in Williamsburg, James City County, have witnessed increasing numbers of English learners, the vast majority of whom are Latine immigrant children or the children of immigrants. From 2009 to 2019, the number of students receiving ESL services more than doubled. And today, English learners make up around 8% of the student body. Some of these kids are part of a new generation of US-born Latinos. So these are changes that have occurred in the community. That's what I've studied, like the dialectic between that. Like, who are these people? What are the dynamics within Williamsburg that have created the conditions that made it a destination, as the literature calls it? And then how has the community changed and shifted and evolved with the addition of this group of people? And now 20 years later, like, what does this mean for the, what does this mean today? And these are the social dynamics that I've looked at. The first project that I'll tell you about is a community-based research project with immigrant mothers. From 2003 to 2006, my students and I partnered with early childhood programs. These were the first, kind of the first responders, as I was telling the students earlier, to this group of people, to this demographic shift in Williamsburg. We studied the barriers that immigrant mothers faced in meeting the healthcare and service needs of their families. My students and I worked alongside an organization that I'll call VPitch. It doesn't exist anymore. We worked alongside outreach workers to assist immigrant families in accessing community resources and navigating healthcare and social service systems. And we formed a parent support group that met for 3 years for parents with children ages 6 and under, to discuss and share experiences about the struggles as well as the joys in raising their growing families in the Williamsburg area. And we layered a research project over this, right? So in partnership with the community organization that was addressing capacity needs, because they're just suddenly their clientele were 70, 80% Spanish speaking, and they didn't have the staff. So my students and I did a lot of interpretation, giving people rides, accompanying them on social service visits. And what we uncovered was how structural boundaries of exclusion were institutionally enforced in the Williamsburg area, what Cecilia Menjivar talks about as legal violence, right? But we looked at the very kind of the very place-specific ways that this unfolded in the Williamsburg area as this group grew, had arrived and grown. And I had, you know, the benefit of like kind of having arrived myself as these processes were unfolding. So I had this kind of longitudinal perspective of having watched this now over 20 years. For example, we uncovered how patterns of low density growth in Williamsburg and resulting car dependency. You can't get anywhere in Williamsburg without a car. It is very, very difficult. produced exclusionary conditions for immigrant mothers that worked in concert with an array of other conditions that produced this sort of legal violence, right? Exclusion of immigrants' mothers from accessing much needed healthcare and social services. So this worked alongside language barriers, cultural barriers, poverty, undocumented status, and gender disadvantages. In the absence of affordable childcare, recent arrivals, mothers tended to be very isolated in the home. There's a lot of social isolation. Maybe you're uncovering this in the research that you all are doing. Those of us who have been new mothers know it can be an isolating experience, but even more so in this area where there weren't those kinds of networks that immigrants often rely on to access resources, to seek information, to make their way and make their lives in a new place. Meanwhile, immigrant men's gender roles as breadwinners took them into public space to a greater degree, but they faced increased chances of police encounters and increased policing due to moving through public space to access job sites, like construction sites, like retirement communities where they're working and landscaping, et cetera. While women worked in hotels or they stayed at home and they traveled less frequently through public space. For women, social isolation and their undocumented status made them highly susceptible to intimate partner violence as they feared contacting the authorities if they experienced violence. And also if their partners were arrested or deported, they faced being the only breadwinners for their household or losing their income. Because remember, there's this high rates of dependency on male partners due to the isolation. So in the words of one immigrant mother at a support group meeting, even if he hits you, better not to call anyone so you don't get into trouble. Like other researchers who were studying El Nuevo South, as it is called, I was drawn to the study of how changing forms of local immigrant enforcement and the subtleties of immigrant policing permeated immigrants' everyday lives with insecurity. And I was well positioned to do so, I think, because of these partnerships that gave me this entree into the immigrant community, attending baby showers, attending funerals, attending children's activities, translating homework with kids, things like that, and also doing intake forms, helping early childhood organizations. Our research demonstrated that even well-intentioned social service providers, like the very agencies we were partnering with, at times signaled to immigrant women in very subtle ways that accessing social benefits and services could bring with it risk and harm. Very subtle ways, like, oh, maybe you should leave that blank on the emergency Medicaid form because you don't have a social security number. I mean, these very like collecting information in a way and asking a lot of questions, and then even becoming a little afraid for their clients. So kind of mixed messaging that would go on, like, okay, well, you have access to these benefits, but oh, be careful here. And if you call 911, be aware that if the police come, they might take him away. So there was always this kind of mixed messaging that I talked about in my research as insecuritization, an interactive process through which immigrant mothers subtly learned that even the people who are there to help them are walking a fine line of policing them at the same time, or that contact with the authorities was risky business. So service agencies are put in this very difficult position as street level bureaucrats of being there to help, but also sometimes engaging in practices that are policing, like reporting to CPS. Anyway, we can talk more in the Q&A about that. Another project Another project of mine explores how housing patterns and car dependency in Williamsburg created avenues for immigrant policing. Williamsburg has marketed itself more recently as this retirement destination now for the last 20 years. And the growth that has occurred through what geographers call amenity migration, has brought a continuing influx of white affluent retirees from states to the north who are seeking lower property taxes and a high quality of life. And this has created the labor demand for immigrant labor labor force. At the same time as it has created housing conditions, and the way that development has unfolded has created the conditions where immigrant policing and labor control was enhancing and increasing the vulnerabilities that immigrant laborers faced in their daily lives, both men and women. So that's Newtown. These are the kinds of the developments that you'll see in Williamsburg now that have unfolded over the last 20 years. So housing precarity produced by limited affordable options, because as this new development happens, like many places, like Richmond, it's a form of gentrification, right? So rents now are, students can't afford them, new faculty can't afford them. And for immigrants, they're squeezed into fewer and fewer places where they can afford housing. And, age-old story, lots of families living in crowded housing conditions, right? But the location of where these dispersed housing, low affordable housing are located created even more of a need to move through public space. And I'm talking about a research context where driver's license were not available. So this is before the 2021 state law here in Virginia that at least gave immigrants access. But we also know that despite that law, there's a lot of bureaucracy and a lot of barriers to actually accessing that driver's license. So the location of housing precarity meant that for workers like Marta and her family who took up residence in employer-owned housing near the restaurant where they worked, and Adriana who came on an H-2B visa and lived in the same hotel that employed her, this adds to, like, on the one hand, labor control, because the houses that I'm showing here are like right across from the hotels, or they're owned by restaurant owners. And so the restaurant owner will drive and pick up workers and take them to the restaurant, or say, you know what, you can even bring your child, because you can, so that means, you can do a 12-hour day, you can do a 16-hour day, right? So labor control enhanced by this. Early immigrants to Williamsburg came on H-2B visas. We don't see that as much, but the housing coming from Mexico on H-2B visa would be the very hotel where people were working. And sometimes men and women housed in the same hotel room. So very labor precarity mixed with housing precarity, mixed with local enforcement, because folks are having to move through public space and driving without a license, right? And also, when your employer owns your house, if you lose your job, you might lose your housing, and for people with small families. So this is this is the kinds of ways in which insecurity and precarity are produced in a locally specific ways in Williamsburg, okay? But by the mid 2010s, my approach and my focus kind of shifted. I began to shift away from looking at the ways in which vulnerabilities and the production of vulnerabilities and the subtleties of immigrant policing. And I began to move towards new frameworks of understanding of immigrants' lives. And I remember very clearly when my thinking changed. And I have, plenty of thoughts about why this happened at this particular time. But I remember it was 2014, and I hadn't seen Marta, a woman I've known for many years, whose daughter was born around the same time my daughter was born. And both our daughters played in the play group while we had the women's support group meetings, or the family support group meetings. And I hadn't seen her in a long time. I was catching up with her, and we were talking in her apartment. I hadn't seen her in several months. The last time I had seen her was visiting her husband in jail. He had been charged with criminal charges that the family vehemently denied. And as Martha caught me up on how she had shifted her entire life had changed in the wake of her husband's deportation. And she had become the main breadwinner, the only breadwinner of the family. She talked to me about the effort she put into the emotional work of managing the mental health issues of her children in the wake of their father's deportation, and how she went to great lengths to connect them with mental health resources in Williamsburg. She told me about how she single-handedly managed her husband's legal defense with lawyers who did not speak Spanish, and how she put up in her home members, family who came from other states to attend her husband's trial. I was struck by her resilience, creativity, and resourcefulness. And she also told me something very important. She said she felt dividida. She said, sometimes I think about Mexico, but I believe I would miss everything here in Williamsburg if I were there. I feel that my home is here because my family is here, even though we are not all together because Manuel, her husband, is not here with us. But still, my kids are here. And I even feel at times that this is my town after all these years. And that's not surprising. You live somewhere for that long, you would start to feel like this is your town. But I realized in my own approach that I was so caught up, perhaps because I was working in with these community agencies, I was so caught up, and also caught up in the literature. Like many of us sociologists, we were looking at, it was a time, right? Remember Glenn Beck and all of that, right? It was a time of thinking about the vulnerability and the way that immigration enforcement was going local like it never had before. But I feel like I was missing out on the joy, and I was missing out on the creativity, and I was approaching people perhaps overemphasizing their vulnerability, but their vulnerability did not define them, and it does not define them. And that's where my collaborators and I, we were having these conversations. I collaborate with a lot of people. I co-author my work. And my co-author was like, we should be talking about cultural citizenship. We were talking about these other things that come from frameworks from Latino studies. And I was like, cultural citizenship, I don't know about cultural citizenship because everyone's afraid, and everyone's dispersed in Williamsburg. It's so different from where you are, Natalia. That's my co-author, Natalia Deeb Sosa. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that beyond just the fear and the insecurity, mothers, families were also overcoming this fear. And they were also creating their own networks in order to meet their family's needs. And survival was producing their belonging. They were not waiting for belonging to be bestowed on them, which I think also maybe the literature on new destinations is like, okay, incorporation. I know, Gabby, you're incorporation, integration into what, right? Incorporation into what? Like, what is being formed is maybe something new. And also, I don't know that Latino communities are necessarily waiting for somebody to tell them that they belong, but are producing that attachment to place themselves by overcoming. And so it's through caretaking activities of daily life that immigrant women anchored themselves in place and produced belonging, making home possible for their families. And through caretaking activities, they confronted and overcame the fear instilled by deportability. And I think when we think about this as survival, yes, it's survival, but it's also pushback. It's survival as resistance. That wasn't my whole 45 minutes. So women learned to drive. Women created social networks that enabled them to navigate healthcare and social service systems. They would use technologies like WhatsApp, or even in the beginning, just phone calls to have to diagnose their family members and circumvent the healthcare system. So sharing information about local curanderos. There's some here in Richmond, I think. And also even just getting a diagnosis by calling a doctor in their home communities, sending for traditional medicines, things like that. And so around this time, I also, using GPS, sharing information over WhatsApp about school bus schedules, all these things that mothers do. Around this time, I also began to be drawn into research partnerships with local public schools, which have undergone increasingly diversification over the last decade. I had also become heavily involved with an organization called the Village Initiative, a Black-led organization with deep roots in the descendant community in Williamsburg. And the students and I were talking about, like, looking at and thinking about Latino communities and Black communities and the intersections and these histories, how they're coming together, and how there's also like sort of repeat history, right? Forms of racialized exclusion are being kind of repurposed And also, all of this is built on our ever-present settler narratives of exclusion, dispossession, displacement. I mean, these things are still reverberate in these sites, and I could talk more about that. My colleague, Catherine Barco Alba, oh, I forgot to tell you about this. In Williamsburg, it's also important, sorry, with regard to housing. Sorry, this is just another slide that's interesting because this is very different from Richmond. Sorry, let me skip around a little bit. When I was talking about housing and the way that housing actually produces vulnerabilities, in Williamsburg, low-income survival safety net housing are hotels. And there are particular hotels that were built in the 1950s for tourists. So these are the old hotels that like our parents, like I know my parents stayed in these hotels when they visited Williamsburg. And so social service folks refer to these places sometimes as the new projects. And this is, and so like, let me tell you a little bit more about my partnerships with local schools, but also how that is part of the shift in focus to belonging, all right? So in looking at processes within school communities, my collaborators and I began thinking about how do students, and we began studying, working in partnership with local high schools, providing classroom support and tutoring and working with ESL departments to understand the ways in which ESL students, English learners, recent arrived immigrant students in Williamsburg, create those same attachments to place in the school community and overcome barriers that they face in doing so. And it makes sense that I ended up being drawn to schools, first of all, just like the early childhood survey. I mean, I was like sitting in my office and there's like emails, you know, come work with the schools. In fact, my daughter came home from high school one day and she's like, Mama, you got to go to the schools. She's like, you have to see what's going on in these classrooms as more and more students are arriving. And right about now, in Virginia, it's like nearly 10% of children in K through 12 are eligible to receive ESL services, and most English learners in Virginia come from Latin American contexts. That's certainly the case in Williamsburg. So we've done a lot of projects with local schools. This is one in which my students are through a course that my co-instructor and I, my colleague and I developed. William and Mary students would go into a local middle school and provide tutoring and mentoring support with students. Here they are playing headbands. Currently, we have a program that we developed where we have about 50 William and Mary students who are traveling to 2 high schools just about 5 days a week, different groups of students to provide tutoring and mentoring in ESL classrooms. So that's my current research, but let me tell you a little bit, just a tiny bit about the school, a published study from the school, from research in the schools. We uncovered how high schoolers overcame structures of exclusion. And what they did was they created and produced their own belonging within the ESL classroom. And the way it was structured at that point in the high schools that we were studying is it was segregated. ESL students were learning in lots of spaces where they were only around other immigrant students. And the good part of this was it became this space for resilience and community building because students felt I mean, all the many things that students are going through, including instability in their families, the dissolution of marriages that was happening in their households, these kinds of things. We know that migration disrupts families, and the conditions under which these were mostly Central American, Northern Triangle youth, all of these processes that are disrupting families are having this major impact on these kids. They're also working, 30 hours a week in their jobs and trying to learn English and facing learning gaps. And so tremendous, the same kind of social isolation that their parents are facing, they're also facing. So we talked a lot in interviews with youth, they talked a lot about ways in which they dealt with this, right? And many of them, I have some quotes, I didn't want to take too long. Many of them talked about how the ESL classroom was such an important space for them, as was the Spanish classroom, which is also like that was one of the few integrated spaces. I don't know if this was like this. Maybe some of the students in the room, I don't know if you were an ESL student, but there's like an ESL cafeteria table. I mean, that's how it was in these high schools, right? The kids like operated in their own social networks, their own very closed, almost a little enclave in the school. And the good thing about that is they found resilience and community building. The not so good thing about that is it inhibited their exposure to English, and many of them recognized this. One of the youth was like, I told my teacher, get me out of the ESL. I don't want to be in there anymore. And we know about subtractive practices where, students feel that their heritage and their language is kind of taken from them as they go. But for these students, it was wanting to acquire English and not feeling like they could learn in this space where they were. So, so those are some of the things. Okay, so those are that's like a smattering of different projects. My current work that we just found out we got a grant to support like last week. Very excited about that, a donor-based grant from the School of Education at William and Mary. And what we formed is my new research project is about, or our new research project, I should say, along with my colleague, Professor Barco Alva in the School of Education, is on parent engagement with local schools. How do parents understand their students' educational needs and whether or not the schools are meeting them? How do they see their involvement? What are their involvement practices? There's a narrative out there that Latino families aren't interested in their kids' educations, that they don't care, they don't have time. That narrative is alive and well, but these parents also like have their counter in narratives about we are extremely interested. And here are all the reasons I don't feel comfortable in the school. Here are all the ways that I'm made to feel that I don't belong in the school as a parent. And I was just talking about this yesterday with one of our partners is a faith-based organization that operates a food pantry right in the neighborhood where there's a lot of Latino immigrants. And she was telling me that a PTA mom, Williamsburg's a small town, right? So everybody knows each other. Even there's 100,000 people, it feels very small. And she's telling me that PTA mom was like, I never see those Spanish-speaking moms at PTA, right? And it's like, I never see those Hispanic moms at PTA. And she said, well, why would they come to PTA meetings? Also, sometimes those PTA meetings are like 3 o'clock in the afternoon. So, I mean, it's just like those kinds of things. And so we formed this parent resource group where we get together monthly and parents talk about their interactions with schools, ways that they could support their students, how they want to support their students, what's language acquisition like. And at the same time, our students are in the ESL classrooms providing tutoring. And then the same students come and they work with the kids. The idea was homework support while we worked with the parents, but those kids don't want to do homework. They want to play games. So, so yeah, it's not a perfect model. So all of these experiences, engaging with local partners in Williamsburg over the years, I think, I have a few offerings for you all about things maybe I've learned. And if it's okay for me to take the few more minutes just to go through a few of them. So I don't know if these are useful, but the students, Gabby asked me to talk about what's community engaged research. And so as I reflect on what's in community engaged research, and I told the students today, it's not perfect. It's messy. It takes a long time. You don't necessarily have those lovely outcomes that like deans in the room like to see, like productivity, right? That are what we understand to be academic productivity. Sometimes the productivity looks different, like it's a report that we're presenting. We do in my department, the sociology department at William and Mary. One of my colleagues works with sociology students, and they publish this annual equity report about issues of equity in WJCC schools, and that's crunching Department of Education data, and it's not your typical academic study, and it's got these beautiful graphics, very readable. But I will let me take you through just a few recommendations, and then I'll stop. Or reflections. Okay. So I think that for me, the number one recommendation, if there's any researchers out there who are interested in seeking community partnerships and working on community engaged projects, would be show up, show up, show up, show up, show up, get out of your office, get out of your home office. I can't stress this enough. Go to in-person events, go to in-person meetings that don't seem to have anything to do with your research, but you're invited to go. Show up for what's important to your community partners, and you will learn something along the way. New research questions will unfold. If there's a funeral and everyone's going to the funeral, and you're invited, go to the funeral. If there's a child study meeting and they ask somebody to, I don't know, help take care of they want you just to interpret at the door as people are coming in, go and do it. So there's a certain amount of like grunt work and paying your dues that I think is important for establishing rapport and trust. Build the relationships and do the work. Don't invite community partners to your university event or send them a cold email and wonder why they don't come to campus, especially in a campus like ours. Yours is like more integrated, but I was like, where are people going to park? How are people even going to get there, right? And when you show up, do so with humility. Go into these settings with an attitude of learning, not as an expert who has all the answers. Be willing to demonstrate your commitment to the partner by taking on tasks, pay your dues. Boundaries are important, but it's also important to demonstrate your commitment to your partner. It's also important to be willing. Know when to shut up and when to speak up. That's another one. It's also important to be willing to be the expert if your community partner would like you to be the expert, and to strategize with local media, for example. So this was a long time ago. Write op-eds. Yeah, I got a lot of flack. That was before doxing, so that's good at least. Strategize with local partners about when you should be the expert and when that might be useful and when it isn't useful. Take the time to present the results of your research in accessible ways using jargon-free language. This happened last week. One of our school board members made a comment about he didn't want to approve the budget. He's the only person who voted against the budget because he said that there was a recent influx of non-English speakers to the schools and that his daughter's teacher was very distracted. He said this from the days. His daughter's teacher was very distracted with these non-English speakers, and his daughter's education was being impacted. And he said, it should be easy to provide information as to why these students are here and who they are, and are they legal? Should we as a school district be spending our funds? And so the Village Initiative, we've been working with both the teachers union and then also on the local news. I was on Channel 13 the other night, right? But like always think about, okay, who's going to talk to the media? Who's going to talk to the media, and who's going to be most effective? Jackie Bridgeforth Williams, who herself was raised in Williamsburg, and went through WJCC schools as the leader of the Village Initiative. And this time they're like, no, it's you, Jennifer. You're going to go wear your jacket, which I did. So that's another thought. And then respect the rules, policies, and politics of your partners. There's hierarchies. Staff might be constrained and not be able to talk about things in the same way that you're used to talking about them. There's confidentiality issues. And train and prepare your students for working respectfully with community partners. It's not appropriate for our students to be contacting parents, right, about things that they see in the classroom if we want to continue to partner in schools. So we talk to them about that. And if the politics isn't necessarily the social justice or social change agenda that you're looking for, maybe you need to do some other type of work in another space, and work with partners where the fit is good with regard to your politics, because this is all politically engaged too. I think politics is everywhere. Respect the constraints of people within their roles in organizations. Don't assume, this is for both community partners and researchers, don't assume that your emergency is their emergency, that your priorities are their priorities, that your timelines are their timelines, different vocabularies, different lingo. The world doesn't follow a semester schedule. Researchers might need more time to produce results than community partners are used to. Take time to learn the lingo and learn different vocabularies. And my last one is avoid extractive practices and reflect on these. If a community partner has put you in contact as a researcher with various contacts in the community, are you being mindful of reciprocity? Are you thinking about how that's an equitable partnership? Or are you just taking the contacts and going off to your office and doing the work? So anyway, that's what I have for you today. I'd say that collaborative research with community partners is it's meaningful and very gratifying, and I think highly relevant, and what people, to me, who are working in public institutions of education should be doing, I think. But it's also a lot of work and it takes a lot of time. But putting the principles of respectful relationship building at the center of the work helps ensure that goals are going to be achieved with equity, and the outcomes might not be what you expect, but keeping that process squarely in your vision, I think, is really important. So thank you. I hope I didn't go too far over time.
Doctor, thank you so much. That was great. That was great. So basically one of my questions is here. So you're so involved within the Williamsburg community in a very grassroots effort that many people are not. So what initially and continually has motivated you to basically to be someone so intimately involved within your own community? And also, I also put here as well, is it, and maybe initially because you all lacked the personnel and the funds to be able to like disperse all of that responsibility? And also, if you could also maybe, if you're comfortable, you could maybe speak on as a mother and that how that lens has also impacted your role in this community.
Yeah, thanks. I think, yeah, the answer to that question, I was talking to Gabby about this a little bit, is that when I realized that, I was going to be in Williamsburg for a long time, that this was the job for me, right? And I started thinking about it because I had very young children, like what kind of community did I want my children to grow up in? And so that was one thing that really motivated me. The other thing is my students, increasing numbers of Latina students. And I think, my own vision of what a institution of higher learning that's a public institution should be doing and should do. My own politics, a little bit, I'll admit. And a view of research that comes very much from being a feminist researcher. And that is a big word that means lots of things to lots of people. But for me, feminist research is always about thinking about the ways in which, well, the personal is political, to quote an old phrase, but also the ways in which, these intersections of different structures of inequality even intersect the research process, and how we should be very reflective of even how we're doing the research, not just the outcome of the research, but like how is that research being carried out, and are certain principles being upheld through that process. So those are some things.
Thank you, Jennifer, so much. I have a question that has been coming up with my community partners here in Richmond, and it's the issue of the mental health of students in the public school system and how to address that. Wondering if that is a topic that is addressed in your programs or in your projects, and if you can talk more about that.
That's a huge issue well, we know it's a huge issue in higher education, right? It's also a huge issue in K through 12. And in Williamsburg, I wasn't able to tell you all about the migration streams to Williamsburg, but when we're talking about the schools, We're talking about a lot of youth that are coming through, they're coming from the Northern Triangle of Central America. So there's a huge amount of trauma that they're experienced in their, usually in their home communities as well as on the road to Williamsburg. I mean, now we have Venezuelan kids also, and in the mid, with the summer surge of 2014, there were a lot of unaccompanied Central American youth who are arriving in schools. And the issue is there's not enough personnel. There's not enough multilingual personnel, and there's not enough multilingual or really any guidance counselors. It's not that there isn't enough. I don't think there are any, not one multilingual guidance counselor in Williamsburg. So how are we serving these young people? And then we had the pandemic. So we have, I mean, the problems are many. There were learning gaps for students before the pandemic, but then their parents were essential workers and they weren't able to sit there next to them on Zoom like a lot of us did. I mean, my kids were grown by then, but I know my colleagues were sitting there, and my brother and my sister-in-law were sitting with their kids, their college professors. But not everyone could do that. We know our essential workers were out there working. So there are all these things, and you can't address all of them, but we can be a resource. We can be a resource, and we can find the places to insert ourselves. The Village Initiative is really, for me, has been such a gratifying, the emergence of that organization with its ties to the few people who in Williamsburg who are truly from Williamsburg are Black folks and the descendant community. And what we're seeing now resonates with them. The first integrated class that graduated, the first high school class at WJCC schools graduated in 1969, and that's in my lifetime. And those descendants come together in the Williamsburg area. They meet, this is the work of my colleague, Professor Amy Quark. But they see the reverberations, and they see the patterns that are familiar to them as the first integrated class. And so telling those histories and understanding those histories is also like really important. And I could say more about that. We can talk more about it over dinner, but those are some thoughts. And we have our students involved in collecting those oral histories of the descendant community in lots of different ways. You know, they were displaced when colonial Williamsburg came in. Black communities were displaced from that area. Colonial Williamsburg dispossessed Black communities, as did the military. So these stories of dispossession, exclusion that are occurring now have to be contextualized. Same thing with the trauma that Latino youth are facing. It's, it sounds similar to the kinds of traumas that the first integrated class was experiencing, in Williamsburg. So I think those connections are helpful. But yeah, there are a lot of things. Mental health is huge.
Hi, me again.
Hi.
Hey. I remember you also were talking about this stood out to me when you were presenting. You were talking about survival resistance, right? And my initial thought was like, resistance to what exactly? Well, I was thinking about like, what is resistance to what exactly? So if you could elaborate on maybe how the term resistance was being used within this context, because my initial thought was they're trying to like fight something or trying to
yeah, and I think that's that won't work. I think that's let me go back if I can. Oh, no, it's not gonna work. Okay. All right, well, I was gonna go back to the slide from the school board members. I would say that the resistance is resistance to exclusion, resistance to undeservingness, resistance to a message that comes not only directly, but I mean, an image of who belongs in Williamsburg, how Williamsburg caters to certain groups and not to others, including a school board member who's saying, are these kids legal? And, you know, and he's talking about his daughter and her education being impacted. Well, all those children in the United States, according to the 14th Amendment and upheld by the Supreme Court, have a right to a public education. So even these narratives that are landing in, you know, very public officials' discourses. And so you look at that and say, yeah, but that's just a mom feeding her kid and going about her day. That's not resistance. And my argument is it is a form of resistance, because that's why I was talking about that conversation with Martha. It's like her world was upended, but she's still there, and she figures out every day how to still be there and how to get up every morning and make home possible for her kids. So it's not the same thing as going to school board meetings, and as the moms, you know, I have a co-authored piece with my collaborator, Natalia Di Sosa, and we were looking at really kind of similar forms of exclusion. She was looking at a community where it's farm workers, and they closed their school, and those mothers organized and went to the school board meetings and said, you know, we don't close our school. They did anyway. They rezoned and then closed their school. But so you can look at that and you can say, oh, that's resistance. You know, that's like talking back to power. But I think there are other forms of pushing back, of creating attachment to place so that you produce your own belonging and you maintain that you do belong there. You deserve to be there, and your kids deserve to be there too.
Thanks so much for the talk, Jennifer. And while you were talking about these interactions between Latin American immigrants and low-level government officers, I was thinking about the research of anthropologists like Vina Das and Deborah Poole about how in Latin America, the state, the government, is perceived as arbitrary, right? The state is both a guarantee, but also threat, and it can be both, right?
Yeah.
Within a continuum, right? And this idea that I read about resonated with me as a Latin American a lot, because growing up in Peru, that was the experience that I had of the state, of the government. I wonder if these Latin American immigrants that you have interacted with perhaps tend to look at these low-level officers, the school system, et cetera, in the same way, right, as arbitrary.
Yeah, yeah. And I think that you're drawing that connection is really important. And I wanted to say that, you know, in kind of my changing of thinking that I talked about, kind of my shift in approach, I think maybe one thing that I was missing, and again, I think we were kind of all missing at that time in the conversations that we were having about Latin American immigration to this part of the country, was that to approach immigrants not just as immigrants, as these newcomers, but also as women of color in the United States, for example. And so going back to thinking about the work of Patricia Hill Collins, thinking about the work on intersectionality, and seeing those same, so for example, I ended up really looking at this research. I can't think of her name right now, but she talks about how CPS work, how Black women talk to CPS workers. And it's a similar kind of, because, you know, CPS, Child Protective Services, might give you resources, and how Black women also interact with social service providers like welfare providers. And they're always like, you're only going to tell them so much. You're only going to tell them so much, because there might be resources, but there's always this underlying threat. And that was something that I was like, wow, it's not that this is just happening with Latin American immigrants. These are processes that are kind of pre-existing, that are just operating in a different way. You know, like I just like remember this one parent group meeting. It's like one of the mothers raises her hand when we're interpreting, and she's like, "But you're not gonna take our kids from us, right?" And they're like, no, except if this, except, of course we wouldn't, unless we didn't think you could really take care of them. And it was just like, whoa, that is the most frightening thing that you can say, raising that fear. It was like palpable in the air. And she was supposed to be there to talk about social services. And so it was like a real crystallizing moment for me for understanding that. I feel like I don't know how to be because the camera's here.
Hello. Earlier in your presentation, when you were talking about the program you were creating with after school, you mentioned that the students worked.
Mm-hmm.
There's been a little bit some attention to that. A couple of national pieces on children, poultry workers
Mhm.
at nearby Williamsburg up on the peninsula. I wanted to have ask you, how common is it for the students to be working and also going to school? And how much and where are the places they're working at?
They're working in restaurants. It's very, very common. They're working in restaurants, they're working in hotels. They might be working alongside a family member doing landscaping, but restaurants overwhelmingly, restaurants in the kitchens. The servers might also be immigrants, but they're English, they're usually coming from countries where English is the spoken more predominantly. And then dishwashers and kitchen workers, prep cooks. Yeah, so all those restaurants that are there for the tourists, but also that have grown as retirement development has grown, that amenity migration. And it is a wonderful place to retire. Like, I moved my parents to Williamsburg because it's got these kinds of services, right? It's got the healthcare services. It's a beautiful place to live. There's all kinds of things that they can do as retirees. So I do understand, and you can see and understand it, but that quality of life is being produced by somebody, including high schoolers. And the SOL being asked to, they've linked passing SOLs to graduation. And so Williamsburg, James City County, one of the things that we just highlighted in this equity report I was telling you about is that Williamsburg, James City County is really above the state in terms of English language learner dropout rates. And it's, nearby school divisions and districts are doing a much better job. And so we present it and then Tuesday's the next school board meeting, we'll present that to the school board. Like, why is this happening here? And so those kinds of things. And the ESL teachers tell us that it's a kind of a form of push out that the kids are like, the high schoolers are like, I can work, I need to work. They might have debt from coming across the border, or they probably often what they would tell me is just they're there to help their families. But the idea that they're going to pass a content-based SOL, otherwise they can't graduate, they give up. So we call it in the Village Initiative a form of push out, not drop out, right? To use that language. So that's another issue. And the ESL teachers, the reason that we're doing the tutoring program is the ESL teachers, we're excited about working with the ESL teachers to get access to the parents and help us form the parents resource group and continue to work with parents that had been disrupted with the pandemic. And they said, no, give us tutors. We want students and we want them in the classroom, not after school, because after school they work. Can you give us students to come during the classrooms? And this is where I partnered with, we work with student organizations, not just individual students, but student organizations. So an immigrant rights student organizations, they're mostly Latinx students who are many of them ESL English learners themselves. Those are the students that are going into the classrooms. How much will it move the needle? That's the other thing we have to talk to our students about. You can't have these huge expectations, right? That you're going to go and you're going to do tutoring for a semester. And these kids now, all their problems are going to be solved. So there's that too, back to the resistance, like back to structural change versus reform. Are we putting on Band-Aids? I don't know. Those are big questions, but. Thank you. Okay. I'm happy to keep going, but you tell me. Okay.
Thank you so much for the lecture. It was really interesting. Earlier, you touched on legal violence,
Yes.
and I'm not entirely familiar with the term, but from what I could tell, you were talking about it in relation to the control employers had over their laborers. Would that extend also to the sort of line that social workers have to walk between policing, but also trying to help out?
It's the latter.
Okay.
It's not the labor control so much. So legal violence is a concept forwarded by Cecilia Menjivar, sociologist, former president of the ASA, also one of my mentors. So anyway, she graduated from UC Davis, as did I. We both got our PhDs at UC Davis. The idea is that it is a form of violence to deny people life-sustaining services. It's a form of violence when people are in pain and can't get access to medicine. It's a form of violence when children have, the Medicaid, the changes in the Medicaid in 2005, that's another paper I'm working on, the Deficit Reduction Act of 2005, which is like kind of a blip that no one remembers, but it had a huge impact in Williamsburg because it meant that emergency Medicaid that was just a given for US-born babies, US-born babies had to provide, the mothers had to provide a birth certificate if they were immigrant mothers. That has been since rescinded, but I'm really interested in the ways that birth certificates were kind of, to use a term that we use now, weaponized. And then I don't know if you all, well, the historians in the room probably know about the Racial Integrity Act in Virginia in the early 20th century. Anyway, there's these really interesting, disturbing but interesting parallels about the way that birth certificates in Virginia were used to erase Native people and also to create a racial binary of you're either Black or white. And anyway, it's a conversation for another time, but like that's another way, that's an aspect of the legal violence. This really became interesting is interesting to me, is that concept arose out of immigration studies as something that just happens to immigrants, but we can contextualize legal violence with and how it's been experienced historically. The historians would be proud of me. I've never, this is my first foray into more historical perspectives. But yeah, so legal violence is the denial of services, barriers to services that are legal.